There is a skull sitting in a laboratory in Stockholm, Sweden, catalogue number LG-07, excavated from a cave in northern Spain, and someone cut through it with a sword before the year 900 AD. That is not the strange part. The strange part is what the DNA inside that skull revealed when researchers at the Center for Palaeogenetics ran their analysis in 2024. The man who owned that skull, the man who took a blade to the face and somehow survived based on the evidence of bone regrowth around the wound, was closely related to at least 3 other people buried in the same cave, not distantly related, closely first or second degree. The kind of genetic overlap you see in small communities that have been folding in on themselves for generations. He was not a stranger in a foreign land who got ambushed on a road. He was home. He was among his own people, and someone who shared his bloodline swung that sword. That is where this story begins. I was not looking for Las Gobas. I was researching the Umayyad conquest of Iberia, specifically the question of how quickly Islamic genetic ancestry spread through the Christian-held northern territories after 711 AD. It is a standard historical debate, and there is a growing body of archaeogenetic data to work with. I was reading through the Science Advances journal following citations when I came across a paper published on the 28th of August, 2024, with a dry academic title, 5 Centuries of Consanguinity, Isolation, Health, and Conflict in Las Gobas, a northern medieval Iberian necropolis. The lead author was Ricardo Rodriguez Varela, a researcher in paleogenetics and molecular archaeology at the Center for Palaeogenetics in Stockholm, a joint venture between Stockholm University and the Swedish Museum of Natural History. He was not trying to make a sensational discovery. He was trying to answer a specific population genetics question about medieval Iberia. What he found instead was something the historical record had not preserved in any document: a community of people who had been living inside carved rock caves in the province of Burgos in northern Spain for approximately 5 centuries, carving churches into the stone, burying their dead in the same walls they slept behind, and doing it all in near total genetic isolation from the world outside. The paper covered 41 burials. I kept reading. By the time I finished, I had 14 browser tabs open and a question I could not shake. Why did no one write this community down? The site of Las Gobas sits near the village of Laño, in the province of Burgos, in the autonomous community of Castile and Leon, northern Spain. It consists of 13 artificial caves carved directly into a rocky outcrop, not natural formations but deliberately shaped chambers. 2 of those chambers were churches. The rest were a combination of single-room dwellings and burial spaces. The caves overlook the gorge where the Burundia and Ayuda streams converge, a position that would have given the occupants both water access and a natural defensive vantage point. Archaeologists from the Grupo de Investigación en Patrimonio Construido, the Construction Heritage Research Group at the University of the Basque Country, conducted the excavations that yielded 41 burial sites. Of those 41 individuals, 39 were subjected to genetic analysis. 33 of them provided sufficient DNA for sex identification, 22 males and 11 females. 28 yielded enough genetic material for deeper population-level analysis, using what the paper describes as a variety of genetic techniques, including Y chromosome sequencing and genome-wide comparisons. The isotopic data from bone and tooth enamel, published in a separate study in Quaternary International, established that the community occupied the site from the mid-6th century through the 11th century, roughly 538 to 1050 AD, that is 5 centuries of continuous use. Researchers characterized Las Gobas as a troglodyte settlement, a cave-dwelling community common to certain regions of medieval Iberia and elsewhere in Europe, typically formed by rural populations seeking shelter, defensible positions, or religious seclusion. The University of the Basque Country's excavation reports describe it as a site that transitioned over time from cave dwelling to a more conventional rural village layout by the 10th century, though the cave church and cemetery remained in use until the community's end. The genetic data showed that the inhabitants of Las Gobas had overwhelmingly local Iberian ancestry, in the words of co-author Anders Gutherström of Stockholm University, with minimal North African or Middle Eastern contributions. This would not be remarkable on its own, except that Las Gobas sat directly on the northern edge of Al-Andalus, the territory controlled by the Umayyad Caliphate following the Islamic Conquest of 711 AD. For 3 to 4 centuries of the site's occupation, the community lived within reach of one of the most significant population movements in European history. Genetic mixing along that frontier was documented extensively at other Iberian sites from the same period. At Las Gobas, it did not happen. We did not observe a significant increase in North African or Middle Eastern ancestries after the Islamic conquest of Iberia. The community was not hostile to outside contact in the way a fortified city might be. They had no walls, they had no garrison. They had carved churches and pig herds and a cemetery. They simply did not mix. For 300 years after the world outside their caves changed completely, they remained genetically exactly who they had been when they arrived. The genetic isolation documented by the Science Advances study is strange. The biological consequences of that isolation are stranger. Among the 23 individuals from the early settlement phase where sufficient genomic data was available, approximately 61% showed signs of inbreeding. The paper uses the technical term consanguinity, meaning reproduction between individuals who share a recent common ancestor. 14 out of 23. In the words of the study, the population at this time practiced endogamy, marrying only within the community. The Y chromosome data reinforced this. The earliest male burials at Las Gobas showed only small variations across their Y chromosomal profiles, meaning the founding male lineage reproduced largely within itself across multiple generations. To put that number in context, a consanguinity rate of 61% in a population sample is not the result of coincidence or limited choice. It is a structural feature of a society. It means the rules, whether formal or informal, whether rooted in fear or faith or deliberate strategy, pointed inward. The research team offers a measured interpretation. They describe Las Gobas as a self-sufficient, geographically isolated community positioned away from the main trade and pilgrimage routes of the region. The site's location in a river gorge, while not remote by modern standards, would have placed it outside the regular flow of medieval Iberian society. Endogamy in small, isolated communities is documented in medieval Europe and is not by itself anomalous. The researchers suggest that resource scarcity and external pressure, including the instability created by the Al-Andalus frontier, may have reinforced the community's tendency to look inward. The isotopic study published in Quaternary International, which analyzed strontium, carbon, and nitrogen isotopes from bone and tooth remains at Las Gobas, found something that complicates the isolation narrative. During the 10th and 11th centuries, the later phase of occupation, the data shows the arrival of individuals with non-local isotopic signatures. Most of these were women and infants. Researchers interpret this as evidence of a marriage practice in which women were occasionally brought in from outside the communities. This is a recognized pattern. It is called female exogamy, and it was common in medieval European societies as a way of establishing alliances between groups. But the genetic data from the same period does not show a corresponding decrease in consanguinity. The community continued to inbreed at high rates even as outside women arrived. The incoming women either were absorbed into the same endogamous patterns or their genetic contribution was somehow not sustained across generations. Both possibilities are documented in the peer-reviewed records. Neither fully explains why a community that was clearly aware of the outside world, aware enough to occasionally bring women from it, chose to remain generation after generation genetically sealed. Smallpox reached Las Gobas in the 10th century. The researchers know this because of a single individual, a man buried in the later phase of the necropolis, whose skeletal remains yielded detectable DNA from the variola virus, the pathogen responsible for smallpox. Zoe Pocan, a researcher at the Center for Palaeogenetics and co-author on the Science Advances paper, identified several pathogens in the Las Gobas remains that had received limited study in medieval contexts. Among them, Erysipelotheryx rhizopathiae, a bacterium that causes a skin disease in humans but originates primarily in domestic animals, specifically in pigs. The early settlement phase showed multiple cases of this pathogen. The later phase showed it at a lower frequency. One individual from the early phase was co-infected with Erysipelotheryx rhizopathiae and Yersinia enterocolytica, a bacterium transmitted through contaminated meat or water. The smallpox case from the 10th century was the one that reframed the regional disease history. Gutherström's statement in the paper is precise. By the 10th century, smallpox seems to have affected Las Gobas, likely spreading through Europe rather than via Islamic routes, as was previously theorized to explain how smallpox entered Iberia. Historians and epidemiologists had long theorized that smallpox's spread into Iberia was connected to the Islamic Conquest, that the Umayyad forces moving north after 711 AD carried the virus from North Africa and the Middle East into the peninsula. It was a reasonable hypothesis. The timing aligned. The population movements aligned. The Las Gobas smallpox strain, when mapped genetically, most closely resembled strains found in contemporary medieval burials in Scandinavia, Russia, and Germany, not in North Africa or the Levant. The virus came from the north and east, not the south. Now consider the timing. The variola DNA at Las Gobas dates to the 10th century, the Santiago de Compostela pilgrimage route. The Camino was expanding dramatically through the same period, drawing travelers from across northern Europe through exactly the territories where those matching smallpox strains were found. The isotopic study noted that Las Gobas, while isolated in terms of its resident population, showed dietary patterns similar to rural communities along the pilgrimage corridor. The community was not on the Camino itself, but it was near enough to its northern branches that contact was possible. Here is the timing coincidence the record cannot dismiss. The Santiago de Compostela route achieved its most significant institutional recognition in 899 AD. When Bishop Sisnando I of Iria Flavia oversaw the construction of the first stone basilica over the tomb of St. James, within decades by the mid-10th century at the latest, based on the burial stratigraphy, smallpox was present in Las Gobas. A community that had avoided the genetic consequences of the largest population movement in Iberian history for 2 centuries was reached, apparently not by conquest but by pilgrimage. The virus did not respect the walls they had built in their own DNA. I want to stop here and tell you what I thought I was going to find when I started pulling at this thread. I expected an erasure story. When you see a community that left almost no written record, that lived in carved caves on the edge of a contested frontier, and that maintained near total genetic isolation across 5 centuries, your first instinct, if you have been doing this kind of research long enough, is to look for the moment someone decided to make them disappear. A conquest, a forced conversion, a deliberate suppression of their existence from the historical record. That story is not here. What is here is something harder to hold. A community that made choices, whether out of fear, faith, or a logic we cannot fully reconstruct, that kept them separate from everything happening around them. The Islamic conquest came and went. The frontier shifted, the pilgrimage routes filled with travelers from across the continent. None of it, for 3 to 4 centuries, changed who they were marrying or what they were eating. And then something changed, not dramatically, not all at once. By the 10th century, outside women arrived. Smallpox arrived. By the 11th century, the caves were empty. The record does not tell us why they left. It tells us what happened to them while they stayed, and that is genuinely a stranger thing than the story I was looking for. Let me lay out the sequence, because when you line it up in order, something emerges that is worth sitting with. Between approximately 530 and 700 AD, a small group of people, the genetic evidence points to a founding population with overwhelmingly local Iberian ancestry, established themselves in 13 carved caves in the Burgos Gorge. They built churches. They buried their dead in the walls. The Y chromosome data suggests the founding male lineage was narrow, a small number of men whose sons married within the group, whose grandsons did the same. The consanguinity rate among the earliest burials reflects this. The community from its first generation was sealed. In 711 AD, Umayyad forces crossed from North Africa and conquered most of the Iberian Peninsula within 3 years. The northern frontier of Al-Andalus ran through territory that included the province of Burgos. Las Gobas was geographically close enough to that frontier to have been affected. Isotopic and genetic records from other northern Iberian sites from the same period document population movement, intermarriage, and cultural exchange across the Al-Andalus boundary. At Las Gobas, none of this registered in the DNA. For approximately 300 years, the sequence holds external upheaval, internal stasis. The community continued, the inbreeding continued. The pig farming continued, the cave churches continued. Then, sometime in the late 9th or early 10th century, the stratigraphic evidence does not pinpoint an exact year. The pattern broke. Women arrived from outside. The isotopic signatures in their tooth enamel told researchers they grew up somewhere else. Smallpox arrived, carried by a disease route that traced back not to the south, but to the pilgrimage corridor running east to west across northern Europe. By the mid-11th century, the necropolis was the only part of Las Gobas still in use. The community had relocated to a more conventional village layout nearby. The caves held only the dead. Each of these steps has a plausible individual explanation, but the sequence, sealed for 3 centuries, then opened to disease before it was open to genetic diversity, does not look like randomness. It looks like a pattern whose logic we are still missing. Think about what it would have meant to be born in Las Gobas in, say, 850 AD. You would have been born in a cave. Not a crude shelter, a carved-shaped chamber with a church a short walk away cut from the same stone. You would have grown up knowing the names of every person in your community, because there were not many of them. The genetic data suggests a population small enough that most people you knew were related to you in some traceable way. The man who taught you to work with the pigs, the woman who prepared the dead for burial, the elder who remembered when the Great Conquest happened, decades before you were born, a conquest that changed the world outside those caves, a world you may have heard described but never walked through. By 850 AD, the Al-Andalus frontier was a generation old in living memories. The stories of what the world outside looked like, the cities, the courts, the routes where pilgrims walked, would have arrived second-hand if at all, and yet the community held. People married who they were told to marry or who they chose from within the limited circle of people they knew. The pig herds were managed. The graves were dug. At some point in that 10th century, a woman arrived who had grown up somewhere else. Her tooth enamel said so, in isotopic ratios that were not local. She was buried at Las Gobas. We do not know if she came willingly or was brought. We do not know if she knew what kind of place she was entering, but she is in the record now. She has a catalog number, she has DNA, and buried near her, within decades, based on the stratigraphy, is the man whose bones carried the variola virus that killed him. Somewhere in your family there is a story your grandmother kept to herself. A place she came from, a silence she maintained. You probably thought it was grief. It may have been something more complicated than that. The caves are still there. They are accessible today near the village of Laño in the province of Burgos, Spain, listed under the management of the Construction Heritage Research Group at the University of the Basque Country. The site has not been filled in, demolished, or relocated to a museum basement. The carved doorways are still visible in the rocky outcrop. The geometry of the chambers, the ones that were churches, the ones that were homes, the ones that became graves, can still be walked. The paper published in Science Advances on the 28th of August 2024, DOI 10.1126 Sciat v. ADP 8625 is publicly accessible. Every data point in this video comes from that paper, from the isotopic study in Quaternary International, or from the researchers themselves, writing in their own names. The bones are in Stockholm, the caves are in Burgos. The question of why 500 years of recorded history left almost no record of this community is sitting in both places unanswered. Some walls keep the world out, some walls keep the world in. Las Gobas was both, and we are only now learning the difference.